It's the 20th of February and this is Irene Finlayson interviewing Heather Coeur for the Cheltenham Local History project. Heather, can you tell me something about your connections with Cheltenham and what brought you here in the first place?
Yes, certainly. I spent my teenage years in Quedgeley because my father was in the RAF there, and I did secondary school in Gloucester, and so of course I had friends who lived in Cheltenham, so I used to come over quite a lot at weekends and so on. So my contract with Cheltenham goes back that far. Then, of course, I went off and did other things with my life, went to university and trained to be a teacher and taught in London for a while, and then I got fed up with that. So we went off to Europe for a couple of years and then decided that my husband and I really ought to settle down and do something sensible. So we decided to have a shop. We didn't know where to go, so we wandered around the south of England looking at various towns to see what shops they had selling crafts, because that was what we were interested in. And we looked at Oxford, Winchester, Chichester, Bristol, places like that. But then eventually came back to Cheltenham and decided to open one here. Cheltenham was called the centre of the Cotswolds, so we thought it would be full of tourists, and of course there were the festivals as well in Cheltenham. So that was obviously a good thing to bring clients to our shop.
Tell me a bit more about the shop, Heather, and what you sold and where you got it from and what it was like being a retailer in Cheltenham.
Well, we wanted the shop to sell things only from Gloucestershire. It was all local crafts. So we scouted around all over the Cotswolds and the Forest of Dean and so on, and found lots of potters, wood turners, all sorts of different craftspeople doing things, and then we used to buy the products from them and then sell them in the shop. We had a lovely range of things, as I say, pottery, woodwork, jewellery. We had a glass engraver who worked from Gloucester, and we used to send the glasses over to him in Gloucester, and he would engrave whatever the customer wanted on, coat of arms or just a name or a date or whatever, and then send it back, and then we would sell it on to the client. Of course, we had dried flower pictures, soft toys, landscape candles, which were very beautiful, with a fern or something impressed onto the outside of the candle, and the candle made of different colours, so it looked very three-dimensional and lovely. Cards. Oh, and of course another big seller was macrame, which was a craft which had sort of been, I suppose, resurrected a bit, and my husband used to make a lot of plant holders. So the macrame plant holder hung from a hook on the wall or the ceiling or something like that, and then you would have a plant growing from a bowl hanging there. They were extremely popular. Of course, some people went direct to the craftspeople and bought from them, but a lot of people did come to us, although they were more sort of middle-aged type of people. I think younger people in the late 70s, early 80s were going more towards mass-produced things and cheaper items, so we didn't have a huge number of younger customers. They were mostly more middle-aged or getting on a bit. I think older customers liked the authenticity of locally produced crafts, but of course they were limited in number, so we were always struggling to improve our client footfall, really, because this was always a problem, just being able to sell enough stuff to make a living, basically. The customers absolutely loved the crafts and were quite regular in coming back, if they had to buy presents for people or whatever. But this was a problem. In fact, it was our major problem, was that we didn't get the turnover.
Your shop was in the Lower High Street, Heather. What was that like at the time? Was it a good place to be, and what other shops were around, and what types of retailers were they?
It was a cheap area of town. This was why we could afford to be shopkeepers, because we found a cheap area of town. So that was a disadvantage from our point of view, then that we were selling something which didn't, it would have been much more popular if it had been in the promenade, for example, or further up the high street. So that was a disadvantage. But the other shopkeepers in the area were lovely, but they were selling more things for working people more. There was a lot of second-hand furniture shops. There was a little post office, which was very useful. There was a man who sold electrical bits, absolutely every kind of piece that you could possibly want for any electrical gadget or equipment that you had. You could buy it from him if you needed it. So that was fantastic. Then, of course, there were several pubs down the lower high street. There was a telephone shop which sold all sorts of replica telephones from way back when, the old brass candlestick telephones and so on. Then there was social services right opposite the end of Ambrose Street. That was a big building and had a car park in front of it, and it was always quite busy. But of course the people who were going into the social services building weren't the type of people who were going to be coming to our shop to buy stuff, because we weren't selling their kind of things. But we always had a lovely view from our window looking out to the front of their car park, where there was a tiny wall, and all the old chaps used to sit there and drink cider through the day and then go off and hide somewhere and go to sleep for a little while. So yeah, they were very lovely. Yes, then next door to us, originally we had a ladies' dress shop, in fact, but that closed down, and we had an ice cream parlour move in next door. So that was much better from our point of view, because people came down to get an ice cream and they'd also buy a lovely pot or a mug or something at the same time. So that was good. And then on the other side of us, we had a musical instrument shop, which was fantastic. The man who owned it had been a drummer on cruise ships with his little band, and then he came back and settled down and had a lovely musical instrument shop. So he was very nice and a lovely neighbour. Basically, we didn't sell enough from our shop to keep going for, well, I think we stayed in retail for about 5 years, but it was hard work. And we needed racegoers, for example. They were very, very popular, and they loved our shop because they used to come in with a slight guilt complex, I think, leaving their wives and families behind. So they always used to come in and buy something from the shop at every race meeting. So that was always fun. And of course they were lovely, jolly people as well. And then of course there were the festival goers as well who used to find us. We had the literature festival going at that time, and the music festival back in the 70s and early 80s, but I think the science festival and the folk festival and the jazz festival probably started up later on, after our shop had already closed down.
After the shop closed, Heather, what happened next?
Well, we had a Japanese friend staying with us as a lodger because he was going to Cheltenham School of English, and I used to help him with his homework because he wasn't really a scholar, and so he used to always ask me about the fine details of English grammar. And so when we decided to close the shop, he said, well, why don't you retrain and become a teacher? So I had started life as a primary school teacher, so I thought that was a pretty cool idea. So I went to, I think it was the College of Higher Education at Park, and trained there for a year and got my diploma. And then the Cheltenham School of English, actually, I started work in a school called the Cotswold School of Languages, but then Cheltenham School of English moved up from Swindon and bought up Cotswold School of Languages, so I was taken on as a member of staff in that way into Cheltenham School of English, which was on St George's Road. We had about 8 or 10 people in the staff, I suppose, probably. And the foreign students that we got were absolutely enthralled by Cheltenham. They loved it. It's such a beautiful town, of course. And it was called the centre of the Cotswolds. Friendly, good transport to other towns and cities around and about. You can easily get to Bath, Bristol, Birmingham, and of course the Cotswolds, the Forest of Dean. So the students did used to love coming here. I suppose it's with its educational setting, with the schools like Gloucestershire College and Cheltenham College, Cheltenham Ladies College and Dean Close, I suppose there's a strong bias towards education, and so they always felt very, very happy here. We had students from all over the world, from Tierra del Fuego to Japan, and from north of the Arctic Circle to many African countries. We had students from all over the world, and it was a very, very happy place. We advertised in the British Council offices all over the world, but of course word of mouth is always the best, so we often had people who were related or were friends with previous students. So it was a very, very happy environment.
Did students settle easily then, Heather, and did they find accommodation without any trouble?
Oh yes, well, at one point I was the accommodation officer for Cheltenham School of English because I had a baby on my hip at the time. So teaching was impossible, so I was accommodation officer. So I used to travel around to all the local people who wanted to take a student in, and I'd talk to the homeowners and look at the rooms and decide whether they would be suitable for housing a student. We used to put more than one student in a house if a family wanted it, but we only ever put one student per language group in the house. So you'd never get 2 French students, for example, in one house. So this encouraged them to use English as a form of communication, of course, because it's very useful to use your language in all sorts of different situations, not only in the classroom. So that was always an important thing.
Did you do any social things with the students?
Oh yes, I was also the entertainments officer.
Oh dear.
So yes, we used to, once a month we used to take all the students in a coach to somewhere, Bath, Bristol, Oxford. We used to go all over the place and have a day out, and we'd show them all of the important features of that town, and yes, it was very, very nice indeed.
Did you have to be aware of any cultural differences when you were teaching or dealing with the students?
Not really, I don't think. We had students from all over the world, but basically they were there to speak English. And of course, when your English is limited, you can't get into arguments over politics or something like that. So no, we had very little cultural differences which sprang up. It was always extremely friendly, and anything which did crop up was immediately just sorted out, and that was the end of it, really.
You never found yourself having to get any of them out of the police station then, or any narrow squeaks?
We did have a few narrow squeaks, yes. I remember one particular young man. He was an African tribal chief. I think he was about 18, and he'd been sent over by his father. And he started life in a family, but his theory was that all girls would want to sleep with him. So he immediately invited the young lady of the house. And then he invited her mother also. So we had to move him out. So we gave him a strict lecture that this was not the kind of behaviour to carry on in England. And so we moved him into the YMCA. But he did manage to find his way into the ladies' area of the YMCA. And so we had to move him out of there as well, actually. And eventually we did have to send him home because he thought that he was doing everybody a favour by letting them share his...
Yes. Indeed. I wonder what happened to him in the end.
I wonder, yes. I'm sure he was a very fine tribal chief. And then, of course, there was another funny incident. We had a young lad. This was during the summer. We had younger students during the holidays. And a young boy from Saudi Arabia came over. He was only 15. And he immediately bought a car and started driving around Cheltenham because he had had one in Saudi, and he didn't realise that you needed to be over 18 and have a driving licence and things like that. So we discovered that. He bought a Mini, and so we had to get him to sell that straight away. And then I remember there was a medical incident we had. There was a young lad from Colombia who had hypoglycemia. His parents knew that he had it, but they sent him over anyway, but he was clearly not well. And we decided that he ought to go home, but he didn't want to go home at all because he was leaving his friends here, and he was very, very reluctant to go home. So anyway, at that point, I was told to go round to his accommodation and get him in the car and take him to the taxi who was going to take him to Heathrow. So I got round there and his suitcases were packed up, and I said, "Where's your passport?" And he looked at me blankly, and I knew that he had a passport, so I had to strip the whole room until I found the passport, which he'd hidden behind some books in a bookcase. And of course time was running out to get him to the airport, but anyway I did manage it, and I put him in a taxi with childproof locks on the back doors to make sure that he couldn't get out, because otherwise he would not have gone into Heathrow Airport. But the taxi driver was very understanding. He's a Spanish chap, and he was able to talk to this young man in Spanish, and he controlled him and got him to Heathrow, which was very, very fortunate. So yes, we did have some brushes with the law, but never in a very serious way.
Yeah. Did any of the students keep in touch or want to stay in Cheltenham?
Oh yes, they kept in touch and they wanted to stay in Cheltenham, particularly the Japanese students, I would say, because many of them were slightly older. A lot of them in their late 20s, early 30s, and they had maybe tried to pursue some career in Japan, but it hadn't worked, or maybe they'd had a relationship which had broken down, or maybe they just wanted to get away from their parents, and so they used to come over and try to set up a new life for themselves. And we did have several who married and stayed here. There's one lady in Cheltenham who she married an architect who has recently died, actually, sadly, but she was a concert pianist, and she managed to establish herself as a pianist in this country, and she's done very well. And there was another Japanese lad who married an Italian girl, and they moved to London and have had 2 children, and they've both done brilliantly. There was also a student who came over before the school moved to Cheltenham. It had been in Swindon, and this young Japanese lad had been a student in Swindon, and then when the school moved to Cheltenham, he moved with it. And then I joined the school, so I taught him for maybe a term or something like that. Then he went back to Japan. He was in his early 20s. He went back to Japan and married a Japanese lady, and they had several children. And we corresponded a little bit at Christmas or something. And then about 20 years later, he said, "My son would like to learn English. Could he come to your school, please? And will you teach him English?" So his son came back, and he did extremely well. I taught him for about 2 years, I suppose, and then he went on to the University of Gloucestershire, which had just started up at that time. And he did a degree in tourism, and then went back to Japan. Then he got married, and his father said to me secretly, "Heather, would you please come over and be the secret guest of honour at my son's wedding?" So I went over to Japan. This was about 2 years ago, and I had a fabulous time, an absolutely wonderful holiday in Japan, and it was very exciting to be part of a Japanese wedding. And now he's got his own little baby, so you never know, maybe there will be a third generation of that family coming over in a few years.
Well, I certainly hope so.
Yes.
There's not many people can say they have done that, Heather. You've had a very interesting work life. Outside of that, how has Cheltenham been as a place to socialise and find interests?
I think it's a lovely town to live in. I'm saddened by the demise of the high street, because so many shops have closed down. There have been so many changes. You know, we've lost the Beechwood Arcade. In the old days, there were all sorts of small independent shops, but now it's nearly all the big chain shops in Cheltenham. And the arcades, of course, the brewery arcade is completely new and different. Before, we had 2 cinemas in Cheltenham when I first came here, and now there's only the one Cineworld in the Beechwood Arcade. John Lewis has taken over, the brewery arcade. John Lewis has taken over the Beechwood Arcade. The Regent Arcade was built, but I don't really feel that that's an exciting place to go. It's I don't know. I preferred Cheltenham in the old days, I must say. I think it was much more lively and bright. Nowadays, with online shopping and so on, I think the shops are really struggling, and I think it's a terrible shame. But of course, the good things which have happened to Cheltenham are the festivals, which have grown in importance and in number, because we now have the Literature Festival, the Music Festival, the Jazz Festival, the Folk Festival, and the Science Festival, and all of these are fantastic. They're really, really exciting and stimulating, and I love going to all of those. Of course, Cheltenham's a fabulous place to live because you're within striking distance of everything, well, maybe except the sea, which is a bit far away, but you can have mountains and rivers and forests and big cities and everything all within an hour, and it's a fabulous place to live from that point of view. You're out in the countryside within a twinkling, and it's really lovely. I'm a big walker, so I love going all over the place walking, and I really appreciate the countryside all around.
Well, that sounds a very positive note on which to end, Heather. Thank you very much for your time and for telling us about your experience of Cheltenham.